Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our Advent time together. Welcome to Storytime with me. I'm so glad you're here, or if you're watching later, I'm so glad you're here. So, we are continuing our study in Jotham's journey, and tonight our reading is called Consequences. Ooh. In our home, we talk about good consequences and not good consequences. So, there are always consequences for our actions, no matter what. And I like to start our time together with the study and then do the reading and then kind of, recap the study. So throughout the Bible, we see story after story sharing the terrible consequences of sin. From Adam and Eve being thrown out of the garden to the entire world being destroyed because of a flood, the dangers, the destruction of adultery, so many different things. And today in our story, Jotham is going to be learning a little bit about this and learning about owning his stuff, and realizing that making these mistakes that we make, and I'm not talking about an oops, right? So much as I'm talking about these habitual things that keep us in trouble, that separate us from God, that coming to a place where we're acknowledging that, we're owning it, and we're ready to deal with it. I just want to read this. Christmas is a happy time, but it is happy because God loved us enough to save us from our own selfishness. Selfishness here is such a word in due season, that which makes us really miserable and unhappy, it's truly grounded in this selfishness, which can manifest in so many ways. It can be literal selfishness, it can be fear, it can be anything. He came to show us, God did, that even when we must suffer the consequences, ever been there? Of course we have, of our actions, there is still hope and forgiveness through Jesus. Oh, that's so good. So with that, we'll come back and we'll touch on this again. And maybe as we're reading and you're just kind of reflecting and listening to it tonight, maybe you might take a pause for the cause of the season. Happy Advent season. You might take a pause for the cause and just be like reflecting and asking God to speak to your heart about areas where maybe selfishness, stubbornness, or fear, things that have gotten in your way of really being able to come close to the Lord and or to be able to just come to terms with things in your life that need to change. Because in order for things to change in our life, we have to change. In order for something to be different, we have to come to a place where we're willing to make a difference. We're willing to be different, and we're willing to change. So think about that, maybe about some of the consequences, unfortunately, that you've had to deal with because of that in our lives. I think that this is a lot of stuff that we all have to deal with all the time. And I want this Advent season to be a time of self-discovery and change. Okay. So consequences. Jotham's heart stopped and his mouth went dry. His knees began to shake and he felt all the blood draining from his head. Decca of Megiddo sat at the table, staring at Jotham and his companions, picking his teeth with a knife. Ooh. Yeah, he smiled, but it was not the smile of a friend glad to see a long-lost companion. It was instead a smile of one who enjoyed killing and was about to do so. The other three men were still talking. Finally, Nathan noticed the look on Jotham's face. He looked towards the door. Then he, too, felt the blood drain from his head. A moment later, the other two men noticed and recognized Decca. They didn't know about the trouble Jotham and Nathan had barely lived through, but they did know Decca was an evil man, and that any room he was in was not a safe room to be. So, Decca said, drawing it out. So I guess it would be more like so. Decca said, drawing it out so that it struck the group like a bullwhip. The fool is no fool and tries to make a fool of Decca of Megiddo. Do you remember that? A few readings back when Nathan pretended to be a fool and had the little hat on and acted like he was kind of insane and crazy in order to save Jotham. Okay, here we go. Nathan set his jaw and drew his shoulders up straight, but said nothing. Jotham's knees shook even harder as Decca turned towards him. I have followed you far, little one, Decca said as he stared at Jotham. I thought I had lost you forever. But then in you walk like a lamb to the slaughter. He threw back his head and laughed, and it sounded to Jotham like the roar of a lion and the laugh of a hyena all put together. Silas the merchant and Hesra of Bethlehem stepped up beside Nathan, ready to join him in whatever was to come. As Decca's attention was on Jotham, Nathan whispered, Hesra, when the fighting starts, take Jotham and run. Friend, you are outnumbered. I cannot leave you to fight alone. Hesra was right, of course. Decca had 4 tall men with him, each with muscles that looked to Jotham like the trunks of trees, and swords that were longer than Jotham was tall. No, Nathan hissed. Save the boy. There is a priest, Zechariah, who lives in the hills to the north. Take the boy. He will be safe. Hesra didn't like the idea of leaving his friends to fight 5 bigger men, but he knew he must honor Nathan's wishes. Very well. Very well, he whispered. I will take care of the boy. Jehovah will be with you. Suddenly, Decca turned his attention to Nathan. And you fool, he spat, his drawing curved sword. It is you who stole my prize, and for that you must die. Decca's sword sliced through the air directly at Nathan's stomach, but Nathan jumped aside. Grabbing a chair, he swung at Decca's arm, knocking the sword from his hand. Silas, too, took up a chair just as Decca's 4 men jumped up and drew their swords. In that moment, Hesra swept Jotham into his arms and headed for the back of the inn, calling on the innkeeper to help his friends. Jotham kicked and screamed at Hesra to let him help Nathan, but Hesra held him tight. Decca screamed in pain and anger. He picked up his sword and began hacking at the chair that Nathan held up in defense. The 4 other men had surrounded Silas, blocked Jotham's view. In a moment that was burned into Jotham's memory forever, he watched as 2 of the men drew their swords. A moment later, Silas fell to the ground in a heap and didn't move. Jotham screamed and watched the 4 men surround Nathan. Just as he and Hesra slammed through the door and out into the night, Nathan looked Jotham square in the eye and he mouthed one word, Shalom, which means peace. Then the door slammed, just as a long curved sword sliced through the air and directly at Nathan's neck. Everything went black as Hesra carried Jotham into the night, with Jotham still screaming. Quiet, I bid you, young one, he whispered. These streets are not friendly at night. They ran to the back of Silas's house, where Hesra's camel was tethered. Quickly, they untied and mounted onto the beast. With 2 clicks of his tongue and a jab in the ribs with his heels, Hesra spurred the animal to full speed. Down the streets of Jericho they raced, and out into the black desert night. Jotham clutched Hesra with all his strength as he sobbed into the back of Hesra's tunic. Peace, my son, Hesra called back. The angels of Jehovah are with our friends now. Just outside Jericho, Hasra left the road and shot straight up the hills. The moon had not risen yet, and all Jotham could see was blackness. He could not even see the ground under the camel's feet. "How can you see where you're going?" Jotham cried, fear of being thrown to the ground overtaking his grief at what he had just witnessed. "Fear not, my friend," Hasra answered over the pounding of camel hooves. "In my younger days, my friends and I raided Roman camps outside Jericho. I have navigated these back trails on many a dark night." Jotham's bottom was getting sore from all the bouncing by the time Hasra finally slowed the camel to a walk. The camel heaved huge breaths, and Jotham thought it smelled a lot like a particular meal his mother made, a meal that caused even the sheep to run away. "I believe we are safe now," Hasra said. They had climbed far into the hills and were now on top of a plateau. The wind blew hard here and would cover up their tracks the moment they were made. As they traveled on, Jotham began to breathe easier, and his heart slowed down a bit. That's when the grief fully struck him, and he began to sob once again. "I killed them," he cried. "I killed them both." Hasra stopped the camel and lifted Jotham to the ground, shielding him from the wind and sand. "Jotham, Jotham, what are you saying? You have killed no one. It was Decca, the beast." Hasra spit on the ground after saying the name of Decca. "May Jehovah reward him richly for his deed." "No, it was me," Jotham cried. "Don't you see? If it weren't for me, Nathan and Silas would still be alive." Hasra hugged Jotham close. "Here now, boy, you must not believe such things. Decca alone is responsible for this evil." Jotham didn't say anything, but deep in his heart he knew that all of this started the morning he disobeyed his father. Remember, the name of this reading is called Consequences, right? After a few minutes, Hasra lifted Jotham back onto the camel, and together they rode through the night. It was just before dawn when they approached a small group of clay houses with a well in front. As they approached, a tall, thin man with long gray hair came from the house, holding a lamp up in front of him. Through sleepy eyes, Jotham saw he looked as old as Moses himself. "Who is that?" No, I need to redo that, gang. "Who is that?" the man shouted. "Who's there?" "Shalom, friend," Hasra shouted back. "It is a weary traveler and a small boy. We seek refuge from the raiders, from the marauders." Do I know this one who calls me friend?" the man said. "No, you do not, but we are sent by Nathan of Qumran. Would you be the priest Zechariah?" "Oh, the priest Zechariah? That's interesting. Let's see where this goes." "I would indeed. And if you be sent of Nathan, you are truly my friend. Come now and tell me what is going on." Quickly, they all went inside the house where Zechariah's wife, guess what her name is? Come on, what do you think her name is? Elizabeth, hello, was waiting in her nightclothes. Hasra gently set Jotham down at the table, where he was instantly asleep. A few minutes later, Hasra had explained all about Silas, Nathan, and the boy. "What is Decca doing this far south?" Zechariah asked, no one in particular. Then he looked at Jotham with compassion. "Of course, we will be glad to hide the boy here until his family can be found." Hasra gently shook Jotham awake. "Jotham," he said, "this is Zechariah. He is a priest and will take care of you for a few days. I must return to my inn at Bethlehem, but I shall keep my eyes searching for your family." Jotham nodded. He had met so many people since leaving his family that he didn't think he had any more friendship to give. And now here was one more he had to part from. But he hugged Hasra tightly, hugged him tightly, and greeted Zechariah politely. "And this is my little family," Zechariah said proudly. Jotham was amazed when the old man pointed to an equally old woman who was holding a brand new baby. Where's that baby? You know, take a guess. "This is my wife, Elizabeth," he said, "and this is my new son, and his name is John." Ooh, John who? John who? John who? Yeah, John the Baptist. And so Jotham began another night away from his family and another night with strangers. As he looked out the window from his makeshift bed, he stared at the stars and thought about Nathan and about the terrible consequences of disobedience. And he looked at his mother's star once more, and the one that would shine brighter than any other. And he wondered if anything would ever be the same again. Wow. So that's the end of our reading, our story. So Jotham is in the home with Elizabeth and with Zechariah and baby John. Wow. That's exciting. And he's going to find out, I think, probably just how exciting that is. But he's also learning a huge lesson about our choices. My father used to tell me all the time, he'd say, "Pamela, life is about choices. Make the right ones." And he would also say, life is full of time. Choose how you use your time wisely. I think that those statements can go hand in hand here with the whole idea of the consequences of sin. Jotham, we now know why he is sad, that he lost Nathan and Silas, and he's sad that he is partly to blame. Now, obviously, we understand that evil was done at the hands of that evil man, Decca, but if we trace the bouncing ball backwards, we can see that this all began through Jotham choosing to be disobedient. Now, aren't you glad for forgiveness? All right, let's continue. We sometimes, wrong part. It is much more fun to think of happy things during Advent. Oh, absolutely. But we also must remember that Jesus entered a world that was very cruel and very evil. And learning that there are consequences for our sin is not maybe the pleasant Advent thought or conversation you want to have with yourself. But like Jotham, sometimes we don't really understand things until we see the effect it has on someone else. We don't see the intensity of our wrong choices till we see how it's affecting and hurting someone else. And that's what happened to Jotham. But then that's exactly why Jesus came to earth, to forgive us for our disobedience and to teach us how to love each other and how to obey. Did I just say obey? I did. Obey those in authority over us. As I already said, Christmas is a happy time. Advent is a happy time. But it is happy because of what God was willing to do. He was willing to save us from our sinful, selfish nature. He came to show us that, yes, there are consequences to our actions, but there is still hope through forgiveness. Wow. And how we have to forgive ourselves, how we have to forgive one another. and how we need to own our stuff, as we call it in our household. Own your stuff. Don't pass the buck. Don't play the blame game. Let's own it. And then let's move forward. All right. Amen and amen. Happy Advent season to you. Blessings. And I will see you again tomorrow. Good night. Bye. Shalom.